Welcome everybody to today's webinar on water quality, the sleeping issues in the Murray-Darling Basin. This is a joint seminar webinar hosted by Basin CRC, the Water Research Australia and the Australian Water School. I want to start out today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the Murray-Darling Basin, the many nations spread across the basin, and all traditional owners in the audience today. We pay respect to the owners of the lands and waters upon and around which we are situated. We acknowledge their deep cultural, social, spiritual, environmental, and economic connection to land and waters. I want to particularly pay respects to elders past, present, and future. And I also invite you to, in the chat feature, put the traditional landholders of the land where you are today. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Wurrung Nation, since I'm here in Melbourne today.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm April Hogan with the Basin CRC. Thank you, Andrew, for your intro and for everybody for joining. If you'd like to scan the QR code, you can jump on our mailing list and receive our newsletters as well as any other publications that we send out. We're really excited to tell you all the things that are going on across all of our projects as well as across all of our hubs.
Thank you, Avril. I'm going to introduce our panel now, starting with myself. I'm Andrew Weston. I'm a professor of hydrology and water resources at the University of Melbourne. I've spent most of my career working in and around catchments, both on water quantity issues and on water quality issues. Now I'll invite Jason to introduce himself.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, I'm Jason Wilson. I'm Gamilaroi and a Uluru Murray from back up northwestern New South Wales in the northern part of the basin, in the Murray-Darling Basin. My work, I've been working with water for probably the last 20 to 25 years of my life up in the north, and I'm current co-chair of the Joint Management Committee to the Ramsdale site out at Narran Lakes Nature Reserve. Why I could keep going, but I think I'll just leave it there. But yeah, for those who have a football background, our state of origin is going to be on soon, and my country straddles the Queensland and New South Wales border, so I do have a foot in each camp.
Very good. Thank you, Jason. Matt Landis next.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for the invitation today. I'm the Director of Future Fisheries Veterinary Service and an Adjunct Associate Professor at UQ. I'm joining you today from Ballina in Bundjalung Country. I'm one of Australia's relatively few aquatic veterinarians. I've worked with fisheries and aquaculture for the past 25 years, and as a dairy veterinarian before that. My work spans Australia, freshwater estuarine marine systems, investigating fish kills, and the complex interactions of pollutants, disease, and dramatic losses of productivity. I've got a keen interest in fishery restoration and work with Ozfish and other groups looking at catchment restoration and improving water quality.
Thanks, Matt. And Nessa Henry.
Hi, everyone. Yes, as I said, Nessa Henry. I'm the Reef lead at Shui, but I've spent the last 2 days working in water quality and catchment management in the Queensland Department of Environment as their Chief Scientific Officer, managing the Paddock to Reef program. Currently based in Brisbane, but I do hail from the wettest place in Australia, Tully in North Queensland, and come from a farming background, so have some good on-ground experience in water quality on both sides of the fence.
Thank you, Nessa. I think we were going to have some poll results now. Yeah, so we've got a variety of different people in the audience today. Looks like there's some academics, a few people with an agricultural background, people in commercial and consulting, quite a few government people by the looks, and some NGOs. So welcome to everyone who's here. And we've also got, I guess, a range of different levels of expertise, some beginners and about half the audience call themselves intermediate. Probably means they know more than they think. And some people who are clearly got a long career in water quality and lots of knowledge. Just looking at the range of interests, quite a range here, from the traditional salinity and nutrient interests through algal blooms, but quite a few people with an interest in things like pesticides and heavy metals, etc. So hopefully today we'll have lots of useful things for you, and just looking also at the beneficial uses, a big spread here as well, but lots and lots of people by looks in both ecological systems and agricultural uses. So welcome everyone, and it's great to see a really diverse audience here. The One Basin CRC at the moment is going through developing a series of confluence papers on different issues, and we're talking about one particular paper today, which is on water quality. So the aim here is really to provide a discussion, a scene setting, and to look at where there might be gaps around issues, rather than some of the other webinars that the CRC might put on, which are more towards the end of sort of a research program where there's a whole lot of great solutions. So what we're aiming to do in this confluence paper is really look at the base level of understanding of water quality issues from a management perspective, based in the literature of the Murray-Darling Basin, but of course there's a lot of other knowledge outside the basin that's highly relevant as well. So we're trying to bring that together, and we're looking at existing and potential management issues, as well as research priorities and future actions. So we are in the process of drafting this paper at the moment, and we would welcome any feedback that you might have from today. What I'm going to do now is just go through a series of the issues that have come up for us as we've looked at the literature and brought together the various expertise of a whole range of different people. And some of those key issues, I think, well, I'll just go through them here. So poor water quality is impacting on ecological and human health and a range of economic and societal values. We see this at times when there's a really spectacular, really bad outcome, such as the fish kills in the Menindee lakes, or big algal bloom somewhere, or low oxygen events in rivers, etc. So there's no doubt that there's plenty of water quality issues around. In the past, quite a bit of the management has focused on pollutants such as nutrients, salts and sediments. So, we've developed a salt credit scheme in the basin, pretty advanced set of management around that, trying to reduce salt loads, etc. in rivers. So there's quite a lot of knowledge in this space. These issues remain very important, of course, but they're also supported by a reasonably good knowledge base. But there is also a growing recognition of the potential impacts of a wide variety of chemicals that we use in all sorts of aspects of our life nowadays, that we, if you go back 50, 100 years, we didn't use the vast majority of these chemicals there. They're relatively new. And there's concern both from a human health and an ecological health perspective. Just a few of the examples of classes of chemicals are things like pesticides. PFAS has been in the news a lot lately. pharmaceuticals go from us through wastewater treatment plants into receiving waters, etc. And we have a much lower level of knowledge around a lot of the detail of these areas. But we do know that there's populations of organisms in our rivers that are likely to be pretty sensitive to water quality issues. And we are seeing substantial declines in those populations across rivers in the Murray-Darling Basin and elsewhere, I should add. Rivers are also an important source of food for Indigenous people, for other river communities. People go recreational fishing, they're consuming what's coming out of the rivers, etc. And so there would be some concerns around water quality and the pathway for exposure that might come through foods. We also know that in aquatic ecosystems, there's a lot of complex interactions and chronic impacts, such as from low levels of concentration of a lot of chemicals, take quite a bit of time to become apparent. They're very complex systems. And we still have a relatively limited knowledge of the role of water quality in these declines. There's not, buckets of quantitative evidence out there because a lot of these things are monitored on an ad hoc basis. So that the health and environmental and economic externalities of water quality issues in general are not particularly well understood, but they should be incorporated in management decisions. And there are, around quite a few of those points that I've just been through, there's some significant knowledge gaps, although we do know that managing any pollution, source management is typically the number one thing that you want to be doing. So the direction of action is clear from that sort of fundamental principle perspective, but the knowledge gaps do hamper effective management action. It's also important to acknowledge that for many chemicals, there's a variety of different exposure pathways. So it's probably better to address these issues from a One Health perspective rather than a purely water quality perspective. And in simple terms, what that really means is to make sure we look at the health of people, the health of animals, and the health of the environment as one sort of interacting set of issues. I'd say the best integrated catchment water quality management program in Australia is in the Great Barrier Reef at the moment, and it does provide some level of hope in that it is leading to some improvements in water quality. There's debate about exactly how much, and plenty of healthy debate around that as well. And it's great to have Nissa here today, who's worked a lot in that area. So we also do know that as a matter of principle, water quality is best managed at the source. And in the Murray-Darling Basin context, that means agriculture. It probably also means wastewater treatment plants and discharges from wastewater treatment plants. We can sometimes manage these issues somewhere else other than the source. For example, drinking water, we can spend a substantial amount of money and put an engineering barrier in between, but particularly for the environment, source management is really important. So those comments are meant to be a little bit provocative to hopefully motivate questions from the audience for our panel. And we're going to turn to questions now. So just a reminder to use the Q&A panel to ask some questions. Also, you've got the ability to upvote different questions. So people may have asked something you're interested in, please upvote that. But we might start off just to get the ball rolling with a question to each of the panel members. And I might start with you, Nissa. Just to ask you what it is about water quality that you think's the greatest concern or the greatest challenge to tackle.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, we find water quality is a bit of a complex issue for people to understand, and it's often driven by legacy issues of decades of catchment modification that have led to that long-term erosion and catchment land use intensification that increase those nutrient and other pollutant losses. But actually, our greatest challenges are needing to work with the wide range of land managers to improve those land management practices over such an extensive area. We've got about 430,000 square kilometres in the Great Barrier Reef catchments, not as big as your Murray-Darling, but yeah, there's about 13,000 landholders in that area that we're trying to work with to improve those practices. And we've been funding on-ground practices since about 2009, but you can see by our progress to the targets, we're not really where we need to be, even though we've made some really good progress to date. So yeah, the ongoing challenge is often on the social side of things to convince people to change long-term practice.
Thanks, Nissa. I might put the same question to you, Matt. The biggest challenge.
Thanks. Look, I think waters that we find in our rivers, they're really a mirror to the catchments that the water falls upon. And from the headwaters to the sea, our water has become and is polluted beyond the level that the ecosystem can assimilate. We can't assimilate the waste that we're generating into our waterways. We have too much sediment, too much nutrient, and too many petrochemicals that cover a vast array arriving into these ecosystems, and it's causing them to collapse, to cause dysfunction and decay. Our land is also suffering similarly, where we have insects, birds, and declining human health. So we do have a great challenge, and it's changing away from the status quo. And this is a great social challenge. It's a great economic challenge, given that the systems we have in place do have a number of incentives that are entrenching them and not incentivizing change. So this, I think, is our great challenge of our time, and our time is running out to address it.
Thanks, Matt. Jason, your turn.
Yes, that's good. There is a real water quality issue in our communities. We have enormous amounts of lived experience, prior to a lot of the situations that we're exacerbating in our rivers now. There's several things that I could go into, but I'll be more succinct and sharp about we are severely impacted, and the water laws and legislations that we're only just being recognised in us. So there's a greater opportunity for water to be understood in our communities. So there's water literacy that needs to happen for our people. So if there's support around for our rangers to do a number of things, their Aboriginal ranger groups, because we see the health of our rivers as one of the main indicators for our communities. If the rivers are sick and we are sick, that's some of the quotes that I hear around the place. And I see that there is are we getting sicker from water that looks great? There's these issues that are plaguing a lot of Aboriginal communities. I think our well-being's, quite important, and I just don't know if we're quite there, but we're looking for solutions. I understand when the first speaker talked about how they're trying to get in contact with a lot of landholders to do the work that they do to understand their catchments. Aboriginal people are finding it extremely hard to get out there in regards to access. And our ranger groups are doing wonderful work, and this is the basis of a lot of their work is the health of their people, and certainly getting that that water quality right.
Thanks, Jason. Just a reminder to upvote questions in the Q&A. I can see quite a few questions coming in here. We might start with one around the reef, which lots of people would like to see answered, and that is what are the learnings for water quality management in the reef and reef regulation approaches to improving best management practice to the MDB? So, Nissa, this is probably a good spot for you to have a first go at, and then we might go to Matt or Jason.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Simon, for your question. There's a lot of learnings, I think, that are probably transferable from the reef water quality issues to the Murray-Darling. One of the key things I think that really works in the reef space is every 5 years we do a systematic review. We pay scientists to do a systematic review of the literature to pull together what are the scientific understanding around reef water quality issues. And then that updates our 5-yearly plan, which is the joint state and federal plan for the reef, which is also joint with industry groups, NRM groups and traditional owners. And that really steps out what the actions are for the next 5 years based on that science. And then we monitor and report on how we're going towards addressing those issues through what we call the Paddock to Reef program, which is an integrated monitoring, modelling and reporting program. And that's reported through the annual reef report card. Our science has really evolved over time from just understanding the basic sources of the pollutants to now what are the most cost-effective management solutions, and recognising we didn't have enough money to pay everyone to change those management practices. The Queensland Government did introduce reef regulations for agricultural management for the key commodities in the reef catchments, which wasn't very politically popular, but was actually needed to just ensure that across that broad area you have minimum standards in place for agricultural practice. And that still complements the voluntary and grant programs, which then seek to drive practices above that minimum regulatory standard to best practice level. So yeah, having that really good science policy integration regularly updated, I think has been really key to the reef program, even though we still haven't got quite the Murray-Darling level resources. I think we'd love to have some of your 13 billion. We've only got one for reef until 2030, but here's hoping.
Matt, I suspect you might have something to add.
Yeah, thanks. Look, the reef continues to be an exercise of learning of many things that have been tried and tremendous amount of effort being put at trying to drive changes. But sadly, mostly at the broad level, where we're not hitting the targets that we need to achieve the outcomes we need. And so this does come down to, well, how else could we do it? What other incentives could be brought in? And the most potent of those is financial. And it is the driving incentive to change business practices, to modify markets, and to incentivise landholders to be able to change economically, because we're asking mostly private landholders to change what they're doing. And we need to maintain their economic viability through such a transition, particularly one where we may be talking about really what are quite dramatic changes to their land use. We see tremendous amounts of nitrogen still exiting the reef catchments and ending up eutrophying our waterways. It's the same in the Murray-Darling. We have elevated nutrients throughout the catchment. It's a problem, in fact, in all of our rivers. And centrally, it's the result of the use of synthetic fertiliser, and that the plants are only using a quarter or so of the nitrogen. The rest is available for runoff or movement into the atmosphere. And this is centrally a problem. We're going to be asking to change that. And that's going to require a whole transition of practices, requiring a whole scheme of incentives that have yet to be talked about in the political sphere as being something that's necessary. But indeed, we're rapidly drawing down to the point where it's clearly necessary to change faster and change at scale.
Thanks, Matt. Jason, do you want to add to that?
I do want to touch on the word scale. our nations, my nation, for instance, is only 70 kilometres of river country. And there is a nation above me, and there's a nation, plenty of nations above me, and plenty of nations below me of Aboriginal people. That includes communities that embed a lot of our nations in them. I just see that access is always going to be an issue, but to land and water, but not only the land and water, it's the science that is required to take on and take into consideration our cultural health indicators, but also our ecological indicators for economic reasons, for ecotourism or for water markets that are pushing, the social dynamic now, or the economic dynamic. We often look at water and the quality of it from a well-being point of view. It's a sensory thing. It's not something that we're attuned to a brutal science, and that requires teams of people going out there poking and prodding. We want to swim in it. We want to eat of it. So I think coming back to that point is resources. NISO, they're around the work that they're doing up along the Great Barrier Reef, for instance. They have millions and millions of dollars invested in traditional use of marine resource agreements with Aboriginal people. So that supports the undertaking of any of the work that is required out there in the field. They're really tapping into what is missing here in the Murray-Darling Basin. I know that we've started a ranger program a few years ago, and now that's increasing. We had the last opportunity, and I'm sorry if I sound like I'm harping back to that ranger program, but those health indicators for the well-being of our people through lived experience at a scale level can be the type of thing that can support us to move forward here.
Thanks, Jason. So Jackie Webb has asked about extreme events. What are people's thoughts on the impacts of floods and fires mentioned here? But I guess also you might put drought in extreme events. Who wants to have a first go at this?
Happy to talk to that one for you there. I think what we need to do is step a little bit away from the extreme event to look at how landscapes function and hydrological cycles operate in our landscapes, because we've functionally dehydrated our landscapes through land management changes over the past, essentially since colonial settlement. That has changed the frequency of droughts. It's changed the propensity for floods. It's changed the velocity of water moving through our waterways as we've removed snags from them. We've removed things that slow water down, that drive infiltration of water. So there appear to be real opportunities to modify our landscapes back into landscapes that are rehydrated, that are more drought resistant. These, again, require significant transitions in farming practices. And these are things that, again, require significant support. But the opportunities are there to modify those particular risks. Into the detail of what the monitoring looks like, presently we do virtually no flood monitoring in terms of contaminants in the Murray-Darling at all. There's been a small study that was performed by Victorian EPA that did identify a very large number of different contaminants in floods around Maribyrnong in those areas, which was a great insight to what's moving around in the water. They found upwards of 92%, I think it was, of samples contained fungicides. So we were inadvertently in floods coating our landscape in fungicides, which are critical for nutrient cycling in these systems. So when looking at these extreme events, I think it's critical that we in fact zoom out and begin to understand the drivers that make them worse, that may impact then on water quality, because it's what the water flows through that impacts the quality that arrives in the river.
I can add
Thanks,
something to
Matt.
that too.
Yeah, I was thinking cyclones and the reef.
Yeah, I was going to say some good parallels there because, yeah, as you know, in the reef catchments, it's very episodically driven, the impact, especially our really large, drier catchments like the Fitzroy and the Burdekin. They're probably a little bit more similar to what your experience, not my hometown catchment of Tully, which floods every single year, just about. But we did find that, 80 to 90% of your pollutant loads are mobilised during those big events. And that's really what impacts the reef and then pushes all the pollutants out that then continue to cycle for months afterwards out in the marine environment. So traditionally, our monitoring programs in the state used to just be ambient old school monitoring programs. And Simon, who asked the first question, started our first loads monitoring program back in 2005. And that then got merged into the paddock to reef program. So we've been very much focused on, we still continue ambient, but we do very much have a strategic loads monitoring program that goes all the way from Cape York in the north down to Bundaberg in the south. And we monitor intensively over the hydrograph for the loads, but then that also validates our source catchments water quality models, which model over that. We do a 28-year fixed climate period to really pull out what is the effect of land management on water quality as opposed to, reporting on rainfall, as some of our early report cards in Southeast Queensland were just purely based on monitoring, and we found it was a little bit misleading because it was a dry year, they got a good grade, and in a wet year, you got a poor grade, but it wasn't actually reflecting the management. It was just, tracking rainfall over time. So you really need, I think, that monitoring and modelling with the loads focus integrated to really be, pinpointing what you're looking at. But as Matt said, we only started monitoring pesticides systematically in 2009 in the reef catchments, and pretty much everywhere you monitor, you find exceedances of many guidelines. So we then merged into a cumulative sort of pesticide risk reporting framework because anything that has the same mode of action has the same type of effect. So we now add up the risks of those pesticides to look at what is the overall risk, and you really pinpoint some spatial areas that are hotspots for that, like around Mackay Sundays in particular. And that's been able to focus our on-ground programs really around pesticide use and management in those specific areas.
Thanks, Nissa. Jason,
Yeah, look, they are all natural, and yes, they're exacerbated because of climate change. I'll give you an example around Narran, for instance. Our joint management committee there have been subject to climate change adaptation pathways, climate risk path literature, and the opportunities to start to understand natural capital, so through observation, so there's a whole suite of things that we are just learning from a literacy point of view that are, teams of people, universities are coming to us to put together the grains of sand. Again, I'll point back to scale. I can only talk about my part of the country and the work that we're doing there, and we hope that it advises back up the system, but yeah, we recognize that there is a massive opportunity around, where these big events are pushing our country to the brink. And, I think drought is one of the biggest problems that we're facing, let alone those large floods that do come, and they do a reset. But in between, there is there's water quality issues. So we're working extremely hard with, Flow Mer 2.0 with the Commonwealth Environmental Water Area, and also down in the south, there's the Living Murray program that have been sort of monitoring some of these water qualities with Aboriginal people. But I just see there is still some shortfall from my people's perspective to jump completely into the game just yet, because we weren't there to build some of these massive irrigation enterprises or dams to mitigate against floods, but now changed over to irrigation security. It's crazy planning, but we're catching up.
Okay, great to hear. Our next question is really, what are the impacts, or how is climate change being considered in the water quality space? I know we did a little bit of work for the Victorian government a year or so ago, just sort of starting to review this, but I think we're probably I'm not too sure, but we're sort of still in the state of managing the here and now more than thinking about climate change, I think. But I'd like to hear from the panel members on that one. Nessa, in the reef, hot water's bleaching coral all the time, but what about the water quality side of issues in the catchments?
You're right, Andrew. Yes, climate change is by far the greatest threat to the reef, but water quality comes in a close second in terms of what's a local thing we can actually change the management of, within our timeframes. And what they did in the reef space was they looked at basically what the forward climate modelling projections were under a range of scenarios. And basically, it's, by the 2030s onwards, it's predicted to have annual back-to-back bleaching, essentially. We've already seen that over the last few years. It's actually come a little bit earlier than they originally thought. But the idea was that if you can significantly improve water quality by the time you get to 2030, you'll give the reef its improved resilience to then handle a little bit better those back-to-back bleaching episodes. And what the scientists from AIMS have found is that you have faster recovery of reefs in areas after bleaching where you've actually significantly addressed the water quality issues. So in some areas where they've really managed to bring some of the nutrients down a lot, they've seen that faster recovery of the reefs because, they're not overrun with algae after the bleaching. Whereas in the areas closer to the coast that do have that agricultural influence of the excess nutrients, we do find once they are bleached, they become overrun with algae pretty quickly afterwards and really hampers their long-term recovery. So yeah, definitely something you need to look into and build into your modelling predictions and into your planning and policy instruments.
Great to hear that there's some benefits of making a difference to nutrients.
We just need to do it faster.
Yeah, Jason, what your people have a very, very long perspective on the country. So what are your thoughts on climate change?
Oh, we've lived through it. The last glacial maximum, say, look, just out in my country, out here, we've got a midden site that's over 17,000 years old, and we've lived through climate change. There was a massive change of diet, whether it was irregular water or the drying of the planet or whatever it done. It is, we've lived through that shock, I suppose, the initial shock, but we learned to change and adapt. And I spoke to in my last question what some of the things are happening in regards to climate change. There's plenty of action. I'm also sitting on a climate change First Peoples platform on climate change. So we're writing papers about big wet, big dry, just in and around this country here. But I see us at the start of this conversation, not so much built the conversation around water quality, but once we get our foot in the door properly, I think we can articulate our conversations and hopefully they are solidly considered, because it's a no-brainer that Aboriginal people, much like any other person that lives in our community, want good water quality, as you expressed in the first slides. But we're at our infancy, but we're ready to go.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Matt, do you want to add?
Just a couple of points I might add in there that I think are important about how water quality alters the thermal tolerance of the creatures living there. So we know with corals that sublethal exposures to pesticides, even 40 kilometres off the reef, lower the thermal tolerance of the coral. So when the water does warm up, it's less able to survive. This is in fact true of many species in the Murray-Darling. Quite an old study showed that several of those species, again, sublethal exposures to commonly used contaminants in our waterways, lower the thermal tolerance of these animals, rendering them less able to cope with the greater heat that is coming. So there is an interface between water quality and impacts of climate change. One other point I'd like to make, I think, is around how it is our land use is influencing climate change in the water. When the water flows slow in the Murray-Darling, the risk is that the water temperature will rise in the water body due to a loss of thermal mass. And we can increase the inflows into the system through both reducing extraction but also improving infiltration into the catchment and driving local rainfall. Many people don't realise that trees make rain, quite literally. We understand now things that we didn't understand before, that particles from trees that aerosol create the nuclei that rain can form around and fall then back to the earth. And so when we undertake large-scale land clearing, we in fact reduce the amount of rainfall that area will get long term. And so these are opportunities to reverse these types of local hydrological cycles, which then have real impacts on climate. So by rehydrating the catchment, we cool it down. This is part of how we have opportunities through transitioning land use and modifying the way in which we're using our landscapes.
Thanks for that. We've got a question here on algal blooms from Brian Gagliardi. How well understood are water quality predictors of potential algal blooms? Is it a simple suite of nutrients, physical, chemical parameters, stratification, etc.? Or are algal blooms so complex that they cannot be accurately predicted? And you know, maybe we talk about predicting individual blooms, or we talk about predicting risk too. It's probably easier to predict risk, but does anyone want to have a go at this one?
Happy to have a bite out of it, Andrew. Look, I think if we look at the very few catchments that we haven't impacted, what you'll see is that the water within those subcatchments does not form toxic algal blooms. We don't see those blooms in fully forested national park upper catchments. They don't happen. But we do note in those catchments there are relatively low levels of nitrogen, and the forms of nitrogen are different. There's less phosphorus available in those catchments also. Nutrients are a part of the story, and we know that general risk is that more as the nutrient grows, more grows the risk of algal blooms. It's not neatly predictive though, in so much as an absolute level will give you an absolute predictive ability to say you'll have a bloom today or tomorrow. There are many other variables involved with light and flow. Our rivers have changed dramatically by installation of many barriers throughout the Murray-Darling. Weirs, dams have modified the hydrology, leading at times to water bodies that stratify, that is, they layer. And this layering can promote the ability of algae to dominate. And so we see these increased risks of blue-green algal blooms throughout the system now that are now so common. In fact, they're present at some part of the catchment almost all of the time. These are increasingly a health hazard, and we're beginning to acknowledge in some of the neurological sciences just how much of a hazard they are in driving up risks of Parkinson's disease and motor neuron disease in some of our rural communities. And this is another of the opportunities that we aren't presently leveraging and integrating, is taking health and understanding that water quality is health. It is part of health. And whilst we have a drinking water guideline, we don't accept any interaction between a natural river and the health of the population living near it, even though the science is now becoming clear that there are hazards from living next to water.
Okay, do either Jason or Nessa, do you want to add?
I totally agree with what Matt's saying, but geez, I'm starting to worry now. I'm living next to two rivers, and I'm in a floodplain that's got just about every gully full from the last 3 years of flood water. So talk about hazards, and I'm eating the tucker out of them. So I think, yeah, look, there's other issues that I'd love to touch on, and that's carp in the system. Like they thrive on this type of this environment. But I totally agree with what Matt is doing. We need to, it's causing cultural genocide, carp alone in our communities, because we cannot go out to our rivers and fish unless we catch carp, and we try to eat them, but we don't like them. They're a terrible thing, and they're a pest at at an extremely high level. But it comes back to that nutrient load. Are they exacerbating it? All that type of stuff.
Jason, it'd be really great to hear from you about the sort of breadth of tucker that Indigenous people take from the rivers.
So fish is the first and foremost, the crustaceans, the mollusks, and and then you go across to those things that use the water for drinking. So those terrestrial animals. So effectively, river and the quality of water will go into those organisms, and then we ingest them, I suppose. But we do love chasing fish first and foremost. If you're a river Murray like myself, and then the order goes down. But I've just been tasting some yabbies there the other day, and they're just as good as the fish too. So that's just some of the things that we do. My grandmother used to eat a lot of catfish. There was a lot of catfish around these unregulated rivers out here, and I say unregulated rivers because in most of the regulated rivers now in the Murray-Darling Basin, catfish are still quite, in good numbers. But out here, they're gone MIA. So there's another thing that my grandmother, before she passed, all she kept saying, I'd love a feed of catfish, and I'd bring it down from these unregulated rivers, and it didn't taste the same as what it usually was in the past. But we eat a lot of everything off the landscape, regardless of a river being there. We'll eat what's in it and what's on it, and it goes on the coal. So yeah, it's quite important, our waterways and the quality of them.
Thanks for that. First, we'll move on. Next question, which just marched up my screen. The question from Anthony Slatcher about time lags, and this is something that comes up in debates about, if we do something now, how long is it going to take before we see an impact at the end of the system? Do we see some impact early on, but it takes a long time to get to the full impact, etc.? So what are you seeing in the reef catchments, Nissa, where you've sort of been tracking works and that sort of, and changes in management practice and that? How quickly do you see a response?
That's a really good question, and I'm glad someone asked it, because this is one of the key things we've had to deal with through the Paddock to Reef program. So we used to just monitor, as you know, back in the day, and yes, basically based on some of our longest term monitoring sites, CSIRO did a really neat study by Darnell, which looked at how long you'd need to monitor to detect a 20% reduction in sediment, and it was 40 years for the Burdekin River. Which, we don't have time to sit here and wait 40 years to work out if, our programs worked and the sediment reduced. And that was only with 40% confidence, I might add. So that's when we switched to the integrated monitoring and modelling approach using the eWater source catchments water quality model with dynamic SADNet plugin. And they model over a fixed 28-year climate period to really look at what is the change in land management, without that rainfall signal, messing up your data. So we then can report, in real time, once we know the area of practice change that's happened, we then model it through a series of paddock models for each of the agricultural commodities, and then we roll that up together through the catchment model, and then we can report at the end of system what the water quality reductions are as a result of that land management change, and not have to wait, 40 years to see if it was real or not. And that actually gives us progress through our annual reef report card that, politically can then influence your 5-year Treasury funding cycles, which is super useful. So I think the reason, we've been building that momentum in Reef is through that monitoring, modelling, integration and public report card has really put pressure on to keep, funding these changes, and we're seeing the results, and we know we're not at the trajectory we need. We're only about halfway to the targets. So it's become a bit of a political issue now, which is good to keep it in the radar of everyone. And hopefully we'll get some more resources to throw towards it as a result.
Okay, thank you. Jason or Matt, do you want to add to that and the time lags?
I'm pretty good. Matt might want to.
Yeah,
But
thanks. I'm sorry, Jason.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, so look, I think we've seen that we do have actually some good case examples now of at a property scale where properties have undertaken transition in the way in which they've undertaken their land management. And we've got measurable changes in the water quality leaving the property on timescales of 3 to 5 years. We've got multiple properties now that have worked with the Malone Institute to modify water flows through their property, change the regime of planting, introduce more diversity on their properties, and seeing both increases in flow during droughts, but also increases in water quality, reduced sediment loadings in their water. So quite obvious changes. Some of these properties also, purely through a removal of inputs from their system, so the removal of pesticide inputs, the removal of fertiliser inputs, have seen dramatic reductions, of course, in those things in the water that's coming off. In those timescales of 3 to 5 years, these are really pretty rapid turnarounds that are possible where dedicated effort is put at those. Several of them have been written up and are available as case studies. And I'd direct people to places like Yanget in Geraldton, WA, Bruce Maynard's property at Willydale, what he's doing there with cropping without the use of these inputs. These are real opportunities for us to change at a landscape scale, to drive these sorts of improvements that we're after in the time frame that we're chasing them. One other point I want to briefly make just in relation to the toxic algae issue that I didn't mention is that also pesticide input into our waterways promotes toxic algae. So pesticides, many of them are herbicides that impact the health of our natural algae. And oftentimes it's actually the toxic algae that are more resilient in these environments. And so some of our healthy algae die out and are dominated by toxic ones. Some of our most prominent herbicides that we apply by volume glyphosate-based products are the largest. And these are an organophosphate chemical. The phosphorus is important because it's part of what's driving cyanobacterial blooms. And it doesn't stay where it's put, it ends up in waterways, adding to that phosphorus burden. So a key part of getting away from blue-green algal blooms is controlling how we manage these landscapes.
Yeah, and on the response time thing, there's studies from Europe and the US of nitrate, etc., and there are some very long timescales for responses there. But they are landscapes where there is a lot of water going through big groundwater systems, and so I think there's less storage here in the landscape in some ways, and you see responses much more from what's happening on the surface of the catchment here. So probably quicker than some other parts of the world, which is good. Now, we've got a question from Andrew Kahn here, really about externalities. So poor water quality driven by management in the catchment or wastewater treatment plants, etc. So often further up in the catchment is the people downstream that are impacted, perhaps tens or hundreds or even thousands of kilometres downstream. So what are some of the strategies that we can use to deal with this mismatch or miscoupling between who feels the impact and who's responsible for managing in the source areas? So Nessa, you've dealt with this one in the Reef, I think.
Yes. It's a good question. So in the Reef, we do try to target the entire catchment as a whole through minimum regulatory standards for each of the agricultural commodities. That tries to get that broad, level of uptake of minimum practice standards. But then through the grants incentives programs where they actually pay landholders to make practice change, we actually use our science-based tools to prioritise where those should go based on which ones have the highest water quality risk within each catchment. So things like in the Burdekin catchment, it's about 400 kilometres long. Those closer to the coast and the high erosion, high rainfall areas have more impact, say, than those in the drier, flat, less erosive soils inland 400 kilometres. So we tend to try and focus our programs, using those spatial decision support tools, which are run off our modelling tools essentially, to be very strategic about which projects we fund where based on which have the best water quality impact and cost benefit impact to date. So you need, those tools are super important for the reef. We've managed to squeeze a lot out of our little bit of funding by being really strategic with that spatial prioritisation, while acknowledging you still need to work with everyone as much as you can across the whole catchment, so people don't feel, picked on. It's that social aspect is important. The whole of catchment's an integrated thing. You've got to work on it together.
Mm-hmm.
I can only speak from an experience that I had in the New South Wales government. Like we had an algal bloom that went from Murray-Darling down to 2,000 kilometres of the Murray-Darling, and the response was through some of these CMA, CMC, CMBs with NHT funding is to fence off large tracts of the river, and Aboriginal people were a part of doing some of the contract work on that, but there's been no follow-up. Some of those fences are all falling apart off storage, watering points for the cattle, so they don't damage and don't exacerbate these water quality issues. I just see it as lost opportunity to review what good came out of looking at the a catchment scale. What could the Aboriginal people still could have input into, but also get those memories of a better catchment.
Hey, Matt, do you have any quick comments on this one? And then we're probably getting to the point where we've got to wrap up. Our hour's gone very quickly.
Yes, look, our incentivising improvements in water quality for landholders is often viewed as a cost, not as an investment. And this is partly about how the framing occurs and the understanding occurs within all of government, is that we're not actually apportioning these increased health costs that are occurring in our communities and relating them back to the water quality. If we were to take those numbers, these are things like decreasing fertility, increasing diabetes, increased exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals. These are all ramping our health costs, driving them up every year very significantly to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. It is a monstrous amount of spending in health. Were we to look at the investment model of saying, what if we were to modify catchments by incentivising landholder change? How could we affect the dial on health and reduce that cost? We're incentivising improved health, improved numbers of people working for more years in the workforce, not on NDIS due to their disability and unable to work in the workforce any longer. These are real opportunities. The same goes for our water utilities, where costs are continuing to escalate, try and produce potable water from increasingly unpotable water at the source. Again, an incentive would mean less cost for them. So this shift from that incentives for farmers are costs, they should be viewed as investments, and these represent a great case for investment and for a great return on investment for government.
Okay, thanks, Matt. I might just give each of the panelists a chance to tell us what they think the one most important takeaway from today is. And maybe since you're already talking, Matt, you go first. Nisa, while Matt finds his mute button, do you want to go first?
From our perspective in the reef catchments, the biggest challenge we've got is really about keeping the momentum going that we've started in improving water quality. While we've made some encouraging progress towards our targets to date, a lot more is needed to reach those ecologically set targets faster before that more frequent climate change impacts the reef. So it's got that resilience to deal with it. But yes, I think politically it's quite a challenge because it's never fun to get a report card which shows you only halfway to your targets, and trying to encourage the funding to keep coming. It's always going to be a challenge, but no, it's good to have that transparent public reporting to keep us all accountable.
Thanks, Nisa. Matt.
Thanks, Andrew. Look, I think our ability to recover aquatic ecosystems and water quality in general it is going to require that we have to stabilise the terrestrial systems. And to do that, we have to acknowledge that what we're doing right now is pushing beyond the boundaries of what the ecosystem can handle. We've got sound scientific evidence. We're living beyond the planetary boundaries. We've exceeded 7 out of 9 of them. And if we keep pushing those, we're certainly not going to be able to achieve good water quality. So the things that we incentivise and do need to modify these things and incentivise financially the changes that we need to perform to see water quality improve. And I think it is very possible because we do have vast knowledge growing about agroecological techniques for still producing the food and fibre that our community needs.
Thanks, Matt. Jason.
Oh gosh, that's a hard follow, but I agree with everything that Matt just said there. I've mentioned a couple of things there, carp. I think the reintroduction of fire and some of these techniques that Aboriginal people use to systematically manage the landscape rather than the obliterating way that extreme events are occurring should be reintroduced. I'm really worried about in the Murray-Darling Basin that they're going to downsize the water quality issues. You know, like I think they should be, water quality should be at the top of what all government departments are doing around water. And lastly, I'll be scorned by the birdos around here, but our wetlands also, not only what's in the river, these wetlands where these rivers run to, the birds are incredible. And, you know, there's a real fear with flu coming in. Will that exacerbate some of that water quality issues? If there is mass death, all that type of stuff, you know, I'm not doing a doomsday thing, but I love my country. I love the opportunity that had been provided, and I hope I gave my people a little bit of a thumbs up in regards to representing them.
Thank you very much, Jason. Excellent job. Thank you to our 3 panelists today. Also, thank you to Australian Water School for hosting. And I'll hand over to Avril for in a second for a little bit of feedback. But like I said at the start, we're in the process of writing this Confluence discussion paper here. If you've got, we've had a fantastic number of questions from everyone in the audience. There's many unanswered questions here, unfortunately. Just time pressure means we can't go through them all. But if you've got some additional feedback you want to share with us, please do so via One Basin CRC. And I'll hand over to you, Avril.
Thank you so much, Andrew. What a fantastic session and discussion. So thank you so much for leading that, Andrew. Nissa, Matt, Jason, thank you so much for your contributions and for being on this. It's excellent. So we're really looking forward to what comes out of it. So a recording link will be sent out to everyone. As a live attendee, you'll receive a certificate of attendance. A short 1-minute survey will pop up. And please register for the next One Basin CRC. The details of that are below. August 6th, I'm predicting the impact of climate change on irrigation demand with Paul Petrie, University of Adelaide, and Andrew Hall from CSU. So thanks again, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.